the legal issue that can we see is that whether there was consideration between the parties for there to be a valid contract. So in the case of Curry v. Misa, it was held that consideration may consist either in some right interest, profit or benefit in occur to the one party or some foreign determined loss undertaken by the other. Therefore, there should generally be some benefit being conferred upon the promisor or some determined to the promisee. Consideration is governed by the certain rules. So first of all, we should know that what is consideration is. Okay. In section 2, clause D of the Contract Act 1950, the consideration means when at the desire of the promisor, the promisee or any other person has done or abstain from doing or does or abstain from doing or promises to do or to abstain from doing something such act of abstain or promise is called a consideration for the promise. So there are certain rules that can we see in this case. Okay, first of all, in consideration we should have the need for exchange. The promise actually have to offering to give something in exchange for the promise. Okay, and it must be something of value in the eyes of the law. We can see in the section 24, illustration A of the Contract Act 1950. Okay, in this case, Zaid has promised to pay 5,000 ringgit and extra 2,000 in exchange for the work to be done complete on schedule.
Consideration must be sufficient but not need to be adequate, as in the case Thomas and Thomas. Therefore, it does not matter even if the price is lower than the market price. All agreement to be enforceable as contract must have consideration. However, as long as there is consideration, the law does not question the adequacy of the consideration. Consideration must be sufficient but not need to be adequate. If the promiser gets whatever he asks for in return for his promise, he is said to have received sufficient or adequate consideration, then is therefore bound to the contract. It is not important if his promise is more valuable than the price he asked for. The court are not concerned with the question whether the promiser has received adequate consideration or not. This is because adequacy is consideration is not important to form a valid contract. In Tan Chiao Tu and T. Kim Kwai, 1997, the Federal Court distinguished between sufficiency and adequacy of consideration. Sufficiency of consideration is different in law from the adequacy of consideration. Thus, any consideration, any dictionary may show both words bear the same meaning. In law, the court will often inquire into sufficiency but not the adequacy of the consideration. Sufficiency in law is synonym with validity in regard to consideration. In addition to that, the general rule is that the performance of an exciting public duty is not sufficient consideration because you are essentially doing what you are already contractual obliged to do, as seen in case Steel and Meinrich. In this case, Zaid may try to argue that there not be a legally enforceable agreement between Noor because Noor was not giving anything in exchange for the promise. She was simply completing her job that she was already obliged to do. However, there is an exception to this rule when the promiser has exceeded their existing contractual duty, as seen in the case Hartley and Posenbai. Noor might successfully argue that she did not expect to hit a thick layer of rock and have to hire expensive digging equipment, so that she is essentially doing what she is originally agreed to do. So there's a valid consideration between Zaid and Noor that Zaid have to pay 2,000 ringgit to Noor.
So the issue is that whether the consideration applied is one type of the consideration, the valid type of consideration? So the answer is yes, because it is executory consideration. So before that, what is executory consideration? Executory consideration is a situation where a promise and a promise with a promise. So it is in the illustration A of section 24, which is A agrees to sell his house to B for $10,000. Here, B promised to pay the sum of $10,000 is the consideration for A's promise to sell the house, and A's promise to sell the house is the consideration for B's promise to pay the $10,000. So these are lawful consideration. So it is in the illustration where the rule applied. So what is the case that being applied for us to support our issue right here? So the issue is that in the Woon, Hoon Leong and Noor Azman Adnan, so there's a consideration existed because the appellant sought the respondent service to get the conversion and subdivision of his land, so that the respondent, the appellant, want the promise of the fee, but then they didn't give it. So the fee returned to service is rendered. And the High Court held that there was no consideration, but the Court of Appeal held that the exchange of the promise between them is considered as executory consideration and binding agreement under the section 2 of E. So this is mean that when a promise is a promise, which means that in the agreement, so if the appellant, if the promiser promised the promisee and the promisee want to execute the promise in the future, so it is an executory consideration. So in this case applied that Noor have executed the work done, but Zaid refused to pay Noor the exchange for $2,000. So there's an executory consideration applied in this case.
For us, thank you.